Hello, good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming out in such large numbers to what we hope will be a very interesting and stimulating press conference. The publication of the Panama Papers shows the need for a strong, inquiring journalism to poke into the world's dark corners. We're hoping that today we might have some discussion on that tangentially, if possible. Reporters and commentators in Japan and abroad have recently expressed concern about media freedom in this country. These concerns have been sharpened by the disappearance of Japan's top liberal anchors from the primetime airwaves. While discussion on why was taking place in February by Sanae Takaichi, the communications minister, she said that television companies that flout rules on political impartiality could be shut down. If some are to be believed, the resignations are all just coincidence, and Takaichi was merely reading aloud what everyone already knew. The 2014 Special Secrets Act and other proposed constitutional revisions are nothing to worry about. World press freedom rankings, which have shown a sharp fall under this current government, are an exaggeration, they say. Japan is a comparatively safe haven for journalists compared to elsewhere in Asia. The man who might be able to, and we hope he will be able to adjudicate on this debate is David Kaye, sitting here beside me. He is the United Nations Special Rapporteur for Freedom of Expression. In December, he was due to arrive in Japan to look into the situation for freedom of expression in this country. His trip was abruptly cancelled. The Japanese government said it was unable to arrange meetings with officials. The cancellation was all the more puzzling because it was the government that had invited him. Now, Mr. Kaye is here, and we hope he'll shed some light on the controversy. He's going to talk for quite a short time, 10 minutes, probably a little bit more, and then we'll throw the floor open to questions, first of all, from working journalists. Mr. Kaye.
David, thank you very much. And thanks to everybody for coming today. I do want to start by simply expressing my solidarity and the solidarity of others in the UN system with the people of Japan in the wake of last week's earthquakes. Coming as I do from Los Angeles, I can sympathize with the feeling of threat that the country feels at a time like this, and my condolences are extended to everybody in Japan who feels that. I want to begin first simply by thanking the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for inviting me to come to Japan for this past week. The ministry organized a series of meetings for me across the government with a number of critical government agencies at high levels and at working levels. And the meetings and this visit could not have taken place without that kind of engagement. I also want to extend my thanks to members of civil society who, at the same time as the foreign ministry was arranging my meetings, did a really terrific job in allowing me to meet with a full range of lawyers, journalists, activists, academics, and many others. So I want to say at the outset that over the past week, I've had a real opportunity to learn from a wide range of voices, again, both from within government and from outside government. And I hope that my statement today, both the press release that you all should have received and my longer statement, reflect that kind of engagement and the diversity of views that I have heard. I'll say a few words in general and then try to focus in on some specific issues related to freedom of expression that I spent a particular amount of time on over the past week. But I do want to start by saying that it's very clear that there is a strong commitment in Japanese society to the freedom of opinion and the freedom of expression. It's reflected in Article 21 of the Constitution, which guarantees freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and prohibits censorship. It's reflected in the fact that Japan is a party to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And it's reflected in facts on the ground. For instance, when it comes to the online world and internet freedom, Japan is one of the global leaders in terms of allowing access and having strong penetration of the internet throughout society, and of allowing diversity of views and not censoring content online. There's also, as I've learned, diversity in the media, both from the perspective of the mainstream media and the weeklies in particular. And I would say that what I found is that there's significant vibrancy, especially on the weekly side of the media. So it's clear to me that there is a very strong foundation for freedom of expression in Japan. And yet, nonetheless, there are several trends that I find particularly worrying. And I would highlight, and I think we'll probably spend the majority of our time, given that we're at the FCCJ, and given the tenor of the introduction, that we'll spend the balance of our time, I imagine, on media independence. And so I'll begin with media independence, both from the broadcast and the print side, and then I'll move to other issues such as the Specially Designated Secrets Act, and some other areas, and then I'll be very happy to take your questions. So beginning with media independence. As I think anybody who follows the media in Japan knows, whether following domestic media or international media, there's significant concern about the direction of the independent media in Japan. I heard from journalists across a range of companies and across broadcast and print of serious concern about their ability to independently report on issues, particularly issues of sensitivity to the government. And I think one factor that highlights the concern is that many journalists came to me and my team and asked for anonymity in those discussions, which obviously for a journalist, you value your byline, you value your place in the media ecosystem. That is unusual. Now, I want to divide up my remarks on media independence between the broadcast media and the print media, although I'll bring them together in a moment. I would say that the fundamental issue with the broadcast media is legal, and the ability and willingness of some in positions of authority to take advantage of some legal uncertainty. And here I focus in particular on the Broadcast Act. So the Broadcast Act, of course, under Article 4, provides a requirement for fairness, let's say, in the media. And the comments from members of the government have suggested that that's a legal obligation on journalists, and that at least theoretically, it's possible that the government could suspend a broadcast license under Article 174 of the Broadcast Act if there is a violation of Article 4. And of course, as was mentioned in the introduction, this statement was made in the Diet by the Minister of Internal Affairs and Communication. I think this is a significant problem that the Broadcast Act allows for regulation by the government of the media. Now, I think there's some disagreement, legitimate disagreement, over the scope and meaning of that relationship between Article 4 and the enforcement in the Broadcast Act. But I think the very fact that there's a suggestion that the Broadcast Act could be used in a way to suspend broadcast licenses is a problem. And what I've heard repeatedly across broadcast media, across broadcast journalists, is a concern that even though that particular provision has not been implemented in the past, that it's a kind of potential sword of Damocles, a potential threat to them in the future, and certainly a threat that government will regulate the broadcast media strongly. My view is that the Broadcast Act should be amended. And it could be amended in a couple of different ways. One would be the repeal of Article 4, because, of course, judging fairness is an extremely open-ended kind of role, and something that government should not be in the business of doing. But moreover, the broadcast media should be regulated by an independent third party. It could be a third party appointed by the government, but it should be independent, and the broadcast media should not, even theoretically, be subject to regulation by a government ministry. And we can talk more about broadcast media in the Q&A, but I want to move on to the print media as well, and simply note that the same kinds of pressures and stories of pressure that I heard from members of the broadcast media were also told to me by members of the print media. Stories about pressure, about encouragement by management through very opaque lines of communication to not cover sensitive stories or to cover stories that won't get the journalists in trouble with the government. We heard these stories repeatedly in the print media as well as the broadcast media. Now, one thing that I would say is that, normally speaking, these kinds of attacks on the media happen in democratic societies. It's normal for there to be tension, and in fact, it's healthy for there to be tension between the media and the government. That's how you in the media, I think, should operate and expect to operate independently. The problem is that the system of journalism and the system of media, the structure of media itself in Japan doesn't seem to afford journalists the ability to push back against government encroachments. And you see this, and we learned about this in the example of the Keisha Club system. We learned about serious concern about senior members of the independent media meeting with senior members of the government. We heard these stories repeatedly, and I would really encourage journalists to organize themselves, to adopt a professional organization, a union, in effect, in which journalists can express some media-wide solidarity, can perhaps enjoy a kind of self-regulation through a press council. In short, the media itself has a role to play. The media itself bears some responsibility for the situation. And I hope that these two different tasks together, changing the law and the media organizing itself, could move forward and really protect the independence of the press. Let me say just a couple other words, and I don't want to go on too long. But these are also areas clearly related to freedom of expression, but also related to pressures that I think may be looming on the media. And the first, of course, is the Specially Designated Secrets Act. This was an area where I enjoyed a very strong and substantive discussion with members of the government about how to interpret the act, which is not the easiest act in the world to interpret. But there are several areas where even after those discussions I remain concerned, and I'll identify just two of them. The first area of concern has to do with the protection that journalists have when it comes to reporting on issues that are extremely sensitive, such as Japan's national security policy, disaster preparedness, nuclear policy, and so forth. Those are areas which I understand the Japanese people to be extremely interested in and to be the matters of perhaps the highest public interest in the country. And yet those areas also seem to coincide with areas that could be regulated as secrets under the Secrets Act. Journalists, I think, legitimately are concerned about the extent, the way in which the act would be applied to them. I was assured by the government that it wouldn't be applied and that harsh penalties would not be applied on journalists. But I think that that legal change would be better than policy assurances in this area. The second part that I would mention related to the Secrets Act is the protection of whistleblowers. And again, this is also connected to journalism, because to the extent that journalists find their sources drying up, the public lacks information. And there seems to be quite weak protection of whistleblowers in both the Specially Designated Secrets Act and the more general Whistleblower Protection Act. Again, I had a good discussion with members of the government about this, but I remain concerned that a genuine whistleblower who in good faith calls attention to an issue in the public interest that is a secret and then is penalized may suffer seriously for that. But more importantly, it's the people of Japan who suffer by not having access to information. I've raised a number of other issues in the long statement, which will be distributed, and it will be distributed, I believe, later today in Japanese. But that's available to you. I'm happy to answer any questions related to that statement or to other issues related to freedom of expression in the country. I should probably conclude there because I imagine I've talked longer than the 10 minutes or getting close to it. But I'm very happy to take questions and to address other issues at some length.
You'd be very surprised about how short that was, comparatively. Yeah. Some people like to go on. Just a couple of public service announcements. We are providing simultaneous interpretation. Our two interpreters are in the booth back there, Mary Joyce and Miho Hashimoto, two wonderful translators. So we do invite questions from the Japanese media. Can I ask you also again, if you haven't, to switch off your mobile phone? We don't want to be interrupted. We'll open the questions to the working press. Right in front of me here, I see two hands, Anthony first and this gentleman over here. And if you could, when you come to the mic, say your name and the name of your organization, and keep your questions brief if you can. Thanks.
Anthony Rowley, Singapore Business Times. After your intensive interviews, what is your impression about where the pressure for suppression of press freedoms is coming from? Is it from concerns generally about Japan's security? Is it concerns that Japan offers too much media freedom in relation to other Asian societies? Where essentially do you think the pressure for suppression of press freedoms is coming from?
Thank you for that question. I think that's a difficult question to answer, and I would say I think I would not answer it as a comparative issue because I really can't answer it in that way. But I do think that the pressure is coming from two factors, or is exacerbated by two factors. One is the fact that it's possible. So there's clearly a history and a structure of the media in Japan in which, as I mentioned before, there are Keisha clubs. There is a kind of organization of the media around particular companies. And those companies and the government and the journalists in those Keisha clubs tend to be focused very much together in the same kind of social network, let's say. And I think that allows for mechanisms of pressure that may be soft pressure. They may be a kind of peer pressure that are very difficult to resist. And then on top of that, you have the Broadcast Act, which originally, as I've learned during my visit, originally at the very earliest stage of Japan regaining its sovereignty in the very early part of the 1950s, there was an independent regulator of the broadcast media. It existed, and it was abolished by the first post-war government. And so I think that the fact that there is no legal independent regulatory mechanism actually makes that the coziness a little bit more acute, let's say. Now, the reasons why government officials would want to control a message, I think that's normal for politicians to want to control a message, and I would say that that's expected even in democratic societies. The problem is that it's very difficult to push back in both a legal environment and an organizational structure that doesn't allow a lot of room for pushing back.
Thank you. The gentleman with the glasses.
My name is Ryusaku Tanaka, freelance journalist. This FCCJ is the last resort for journalists in Japan. Abe cannot control this FCCJ. Do you know Prime Minister's office ordered their staff to investigate this FCCJ's scandal? Do you know Prime Minister's office ordered their staff to investigate some scandal about this FCCJ?
Is that a question? So does he know? Do you know that? Are you aware of that?
No, simple answer is no.
Thank you. Next question. This gentleman here and then Martin. And then the gentleman with the glasses. Thank you.
Thanks. My name is Patrick Walter with Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung. I have two questions, if I may. First, can you short elaborate, when you say you are here by invitation of the government, what does it mean explicitly? I mean, I imagine, do you have the right to investigate other countries, or how does that work? Mm-hmm. And the second question is, can you draw, I assume that you visit a lot of other countries as well, so I'm just wondering, can you draw comparisons to other industrialized countries or other countries concerning the degree of freedom of the press?
Mm-hmm. No, that's a good question to provide some context for my visit. As part of my role as a special rapporteur, and as all special rapporteurs, and maybe to back up even a moment before that, I'm appointed by the Human Rights Council, the central human rights body of the United Nations. We are all expected, all rapporteurs are expected to communicate regularly with governments, which we do 300 or 400 times a year. We communicate with governments about allegations related to freedom of expression, covering all parts of the globe. We're expected to do thematic reports to the Human Rights Council and to the General Assembly. Those are longer reports about particular legal or policy issues. And then finally, we conduct country visits. And all rapporteurs conduct country visits, but we can't do a country visit unless a government invites us in. So we make a number of requests of countries to invite us. We ask for invitations. And the fact of the matter is, when it comes to Japan, there's what's called a standing invitation. So Japan has a standing invitation to all rapporteurs, which I think is a reflection of Japan's commitment to the human rights mechanisms of the United Nations. And we were very interested to visit Japan. We've become interested over the last couple of years, particularly related to the Secrets Act. But also we've seen the reports that David mentioned earlier. And so there was a real reason for us to come to Japan. Now, I go to different kinds of places. So visiting Japan is visiting a strong democratic society. And the comparison, I would say the benchmark for me in visiting a place like Japan is Article 19 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which is the central treaty in international human rights law, and Japan ratified it in the 1970s, has been a party to it for many decades now. But it's also Article 21 of the Constitution, which reflects Article 19. It actually precedes Article 19. But in some ways, it's even stronger than Article 19 because it expressly prohibits censorship. That's my comparison. And you can imagine my visits to different countries have a different kind of tenor. So, I mean, I can tell you the other places I visited last month, spent about the same amount of time in Tajikistan. It was a very different visit. And in November, I'm scheduled to visit Turkey. So very different kinds of systems and situations for the media in those places than in Japan.
Thank you. Martin, did you have your hand up?
Martin Kölling with the German financial daily Handelsblatt. First a short follow-up to my colleague's question. If you compare Japan internationally to other democracies, do you feel that? What do you feel? Where do you feel the tendencies are? The trends are going. The tendencies are going, and where do you feel Japan stands? And then my second question is about the financial pressure. What did you also talk about the means, the transmission, basically, of these pressures? Did you talk about advertisement and the role of advertisement, maybe agencies or companies, and pressure, especially on the broadcasting stations and national dailies? Did you talk a little bit about this transmission mechanisms of this pressure?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I'm reluctant to be very specific in the way of comparing the situation of Japan with other countries, in part because I haven't conducted missions in all of these other countries. I think I can say as a general matter a couple of things. One is the baseline is very high in Japan, and by that I mean the legal baseline and the social expectation for expressing oneself freely is high in Japan. But I think that the trends for Japan, particularly on issues of media independence, are really worrying, whether I'm looking at it as a question of Japan's obligations under its own law or the international human rights law, or comparing to the situation of other democratic societies. And I would just return to the issue of legal constraint and even the theoretical possibility of government regulation and organization. And I think that those two things combined cause media freedom to suffer, media independence to suffer in Japan. There's just not the ability to push back or the willingness to push back. And that, I think that ties to your second question. Now, I didn't focus on that, the financial aspect, the kind of carrots and sticks that might be imposed in an environment like this. But it was raised with me throughout the week here that, and of course, not all journalists know what's happening at the level of management and business, but there's a kind of suspicion that we've heard repeatedly that to the extent issues become seen as sensitive or reporting on them becomes seen as disfavored by the government, that even if the government isn't saying so directly, that sponsors and advertisers may become nervous. Now, again, I did not investigate that in any detail. I can only say that that's a perception that was shared with me by quite a number of our interlocutors over the course of the week.
Thank you. Next question, Justin, and then Siegfried.
Thanks. Justin McCurry from The Guardian. Hi. You mentioned that several journalists had told you in confidence that they'd come under pressure from editors not to write stories that, in your words, might upset the government. Obviously, I don't want you to reveal your sources, but could you give us an idea of what sort of subjects you're talking about? And as a quick follow-up to that, did you request a meeting, face-to-face meeting with the communications minister? And if so, what was her response? Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So on the second question, we did quite repeatedly. And in fact, when I first arrived in Japan, I was asked by the media if I would meet with her. So in a way, it was your suggestion. But we asked repeatedly if we could meet with Minister Takaichi. She was, I know that the Diet has been in session and very busy, and that was the response. So I can't really characterize that more than that, except to say that we did get repeated opportunities, although fairly short, to ask questions about the issues that we had in mind related to Minister Takaichi's statement. And I think the conclusion that we drew is that the minister's statement about Article 4 and the legal authority of the ministry to suspend licenses was confirmed by others in the ministry. So it is the considered legal view of the ministry that it has that power. So in terms of the kinds of issues that were raised, I think that they won't be surprising to people, and they're mentioned in the longer statement. We heard stories related to coverage of the nuclear disaster at Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant. We heard stories related to essentially liberal commentators who would ask tough questions on television, who would leave their positions, and here's an area where many of our interlocutors said, we don't know why what a particular person was told in order to leave, but we do know a couple of things. One is, again, this is what I've been told. One is that, the system of employment in the media is such that people tend to stay in their jobs for a long time, and there was it seemed to many people to be unusual that so many commentators would leave at a similar moment. So that was reflected back to us, and other particular areas I think go to that kind of tough questioning, at least that was shared with us there.
Did you get the sense when you were talking to people in the government that they were concerned about the reputation of Japan abroad, the fact that its media freedoms were, at least in polls, being sort of downward trend? Did you get the sense they were concerned about that?
No, I would say that, my sense from the government is that it's concerned to participate actively in these kinds of visits and to help shape my conclusions, which is completely fair. And I think that comes from a desire to be seen as respecting media freedom. But there was no statement along those lines in particular.
Siegfried, and then gentleman here. Yeah.
Siegfried Nidl, Austrian newspaper, Der Standard. Did you talk about the pressure on foreign media, and did you talk about pressure on the foreign ministry to pressure on foreign media about historic issues? There was a case last year of a German journalist who got pressed from the Gaimo show very hard about his reporting on his Japanese history.
Mm-hmm. I to be honest, did not hear a lot about pressure on the foreign media, apart from, I would say, the exclusion from, at least in many areas of politics and government life, exclusion from the Keisha Club system. And my understanding is that, that can make it difficult for journalists. Now, I did hear from some that it's harder in some areas than in others. So, for example, I heard that there's increasing openness in the financial sector in terms of engagement with journalists. That's something I heard. But we didn't really have a focus. We were really focused on the independent Japanese media. I know about the story and the essay that I think was a FCCJ essay published by your colleague. So we're familiar with those kinds of stories, and And we're also familiar with the reporting from foreign journalists that were reflecting the kind of pressures, or at least describing some of the pressures that we've also identified during our week here.
Sorry, Teddy, you want to ask a question?
Hi, I'm Teddy Jimbo with the Video News. I have one question. I don't know if you had time to look into this LDP's new constitutional revision proposal, but I'd like to hear your opinion. The new this LDP's proposal to revise the constitution also include revision of Article 21. While they remain that freedom of expression is to be guaranteed, they like to add another article saying that as long as public order is not disrupted, they are guaranteed the freedom of expression. And after looking into Japanese media and government relations, how it works, what kind of effect you think it will have if such a revision on the Constitution 21 is actually implemented? We have election coming up, and it is really realistic possibility that Constitution may be revised soon. So I'd like to hear your opinion about that.
So we did spend time educating ourselves about the constitutional proposal from the LDP. My understanding is that the proposal would include a revision of Article 21 to state that, quote, engaging in activities with the purpose of damaging the public interest or public order or associating with others for such purposes shall not be recognized. I can't speak to the likelihood of it being adopted. I understand that constitutional amendment would be very complicated in Japan. But I think that this provision, first of all, Article 21 is something that the people of Japan should be extremely proud of as a matter of law, and particularly proud of it as it has helped shape the environment for freedom of expression in this country. And I think that tinkering with it, even if it were minor editing or amending, would be really problematic. And I find that this language in particular would be, generally speaking, inconsistent with Japan's human rights obligations under Article 19 of the ICCPR. The reference to damaging public interest or public order are, I would say, capacious terms or extremely broad terms that perhaps this government wouldn't have the intention of using it, but once it's a part of the Constitution, any future government could. And I would think that would be more than theoretically a potential threat, because it would help frame law that undermines a range of different areas. And a few that we haven't talked about might be related to public demonstrations, where there's a kind of rich tradition of public demonstration in Japan, and particularly with language of public order, I would be very concerned about that. And then the other area where I would have concerns is related to political campaigning. The Human Rights Committee, which is the monitoring body of the ICCPR, has actually very strongly criticized Japan for the restrictions that the government imposes on political campaigns. And so I could imagine that this language of an amendment that would undermine Article 21 could potentially be used to strengthen those restrictions on political campaigns, when in fact the opposite should be happening right now. The restrictions on campaigns should be lifted more or less across the board, particularly to allow diversity of viewpoints in the media around the time, diversity of viewpoints among politicians, particularly in times of elections. And as we're in the run-up to election, it's actually a useful moment for people to be focusing on these kinds of legal changes and their implications for the future of freedom of expression in the country.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. I saw Lars first, Then I saw, sorry, this gentleman here, and then Matsushima-san at the back, and then we'll take it from there.
Lars Nikolaisen, German press agency, DPA. Thank you very much for coming to the club. Just one short question. You told us about many concerns you heard from journalists. Have you also talked to and confronted editors as well as the management of media corporations with these concerns, and how was the reaction by them?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we certainly didn't limit ourselves to speaking with journalists, at least working journalists and reporters. We met with the Editors and Publishers Association. We met with management, not the Board of Governors, but management, senior management at NHK. We met with those individuals, and the views that they expressed were different, clearly, from working journalists. Of course, not across the board. There is diversity of views, but I would say that the concerns that were expressed to us were mainly by journalists. That editors and publishers presented a different perspective, although even some of the management expressed, let's say, discomfort with, for example, Minister Takaichi's statement, or to give another example, the president of NHK a couple of years ago, at the time that I think he was inaugurated as the president, made some remarks about, at least in the context of international broadcast, that the media, that NHK can't say left if the government says right, something like that. And I think there was discomfort among not just the working journalists, but among management. We certainly heard that raised during those conversations, but there's clear diversity of viewpoints there.
David, did the media executive explain to you why they are not willing to open up the Kisha Club? Because they never answer our questions. I wonder if they told you.
We didn't get an explanation about why not, why they don't open the Kisha Club.
Okay, thank you.
Can I, on the Kisha Club, can I just say that, this will be quick.
Actually, my question. I'm Martin Fritz from Wirtschaftswoche Germany. Sorry, another German question. You mentioned the Kisha clubs. That was exactly my question.
Okay.
You're recommending change of broadcast law, and journalists organize themselves in unions to become a stronger voice. Mm-hmm. But I think the Kisha clubs are one of the main sources of this collusion and self-censorship for people inside and outside. Yes. So why don't you demand the abolishment of these Kisha clubs as to increase press freedom in Japan?
Well, I think the Kisha club system should be abolished. My longer statement discusses this a little bit, and I do think that they're a tool to restrict access. They're tools. My understanding from talking to people both who've participated in the Kisha Club system and who've been outside is that they foster a kind of access journalism and undermine investigative journalism. And for that reason, they're, I think, a hindrance to media independence in the country. So what I was going to say about the Kisha Club in response to Teddy before was to add that and this is reflected in your question as well, the Kisha Club system seems to be something that both the mainstream big companies like and the government likes. And my understanding is the way that it operates is that individuals who are in the Kisha Club can go, they can get their, when they go to press conferences, they can get their questions answered, but that there's also a kind of off-the-book system of off-the-record discussions with senior ministers that are seen as, they are off the record, and they tend to be a little bit more open. But people don't have access to those, except to the extent, because I've also learned this, that minutes or notes from off the record press meetings are also circulated widely in the media. So there's a kind of opacity to the way media operates around the Keisha Club system, and I think it undermines access to information, and it undermines the ability for the people of Japan not only to know what the government is doing, but to understand the structure for how they get information.
Thank you. Matsushima-san, down the bottom. And then this lady here.
My name is Yoshiko Matsushima from a local newspaper, Kanagawa Shimbun in Japan. すいません、質問は日本語で失礼します。2つ質問がございます。1つ目は、改めてなぜ日本を調査されたのかということをお伺いしたいと思います。国連報告者、表現の自由に関する、特別報告者が日本を調査するのは初めてとお伺いしました。日本のその政府の、招待があったということなんですけれども、調査すべきことがないと判断した場合には来日は実現しなかったと思います。そういう意味でなぜその日本を調査する必要があるかと思ったことについて改めてお伺いできればと思います。もう一点は、先週日本に来日した直後に報道の自由についてはまだオープンマインドだということをおっしゃっていました。いろいろな情報は聞いてるけれどもこれから調査をする段階なのでまだ何も答えられないというふうにおっしゃっていましたけれども調査した後で調査をする前とでは報道の自由に関する印象というか考えというのは何か変わりましたでしょうか。以上2点よろしくお願いします。Thank you.
Thank you for those questions. So first set of questions was essentially why was Japan a target? At least that's how it was translated. I wouldn't say Japan was a target. I explained before, and I would just say again, that reporting over the last couple of years has highlighted issues around freedom of expression, particularly around media independence and a few other issues that I discuss in these preliminary observations. But I would also say that, as I mentioned at the outset, that Japan is, when it comes to online freedom, to the lack of censorship of the internet, to the levels of internet penetration, that Japan is also a model. I mean, any visit that I would make to any country is not limited to just identifying potential problems, but it's also very important for positive models, particularly at a time when there's increasing restriction online. It's important to highlight what a country does really well and where it's a best practice. And I think that in the area of internet freedom, I would actually encourage the government to be more of a leader in different areas of internet freedom because its practice is already quite free. Now, every country has some limitations, but I think if we're going to go the comparison route, Japan, comes out very strong. And I would say that as far as your sort of the question of open mind and whether my image changed, I expected to come and see, just focusing first on the strongly positive, to see a kind of level of access and internet freedom that, in fact, I did see. For example, we spoke with members of an association of internet service providers, and it was clear that they, when it comes to, core freedom of expression issues like censorship, that's not a concern of theirs. I mean, the bigger issues are technical ones, frankly, and ensuring broadband access to everyone, ensuring, for example, if there's a change in the law related to wiretaps, that basic concepts of internet freedom and security online are maintained. I actually met with the government officials responsible for cybersecurity, and it's clear that they think of cybersecurity both as security of infrastructure as well as individual security online, the way that our own security of our communications. So I learned a lot that actually reinforced my impression that online, Japan is doing quite a number of important things, and that particularly as other legislation may be considered, that there's an infrastructure already in place to ensure that that freedom remains. As far as media independence, I would say that I did come with an open mind. I mean, to a certain extent, you know, we came having done our research, but also we were, I wouldn't say a blank slate, but we were open to all sorts of perspectives, and we spoke with government, with publishers and editors associations, and with journalists, and to a large extent, my concerns are even stronger, having spoken with journalists who day to day feel the pressure of a kind of control. So that's, you know, I don't think any of this is written in stone. I mean, certainly internet, but there's nothing written in stone here in terms of the ability to change. I mean, there are very concrete things that Japanese law or Japanese government can do to change the system. One is related to the Broadcast Act. I'm not saying it's a simple task to get the votes to do that, but they're very simple steps. There's some concrete things that can be done related to the Secrets Act to protect those releasing or disclosing information in the public interest. There are very clear things that Japanese media can do. So I think that those are the kinds of things I learned over the last week that strengthened a kind of view that that this is a moment at which Japan should really take some steps to secure its the independence of its media.
Thank you. I saw the gentleman over here first, and then the lady sitting behind Anthony second, and then the lady over here. Yeah.
My name is Khail Hassan. I'm an honorary member. Thank you very much for your presentation. You know, we elect government to do the right job. At the same time, we have the media to ensure that job being done properly. But the problem today, the risk is election, government, parliaments, media can be bought. And one of the things we are discussing today, reinventing the government. My question to you, how are you going to reinvent the proper freedom of media? Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Ambassador. I think that the first thing clearly is that to the extent there needs to be change in the media, it's for the Japanese people to do it. I mean, my role is, and my mandate from the Human Rights Council is pretty concrete. It's examine situations of freedom of expression all over the world, identify where there might be inconsistencies with human rights law, and when possible, in particular, this is possible in country visits like this, identify proposals and recommendations to ensure that the government and that society is able to enjoy the freedom of opinion and expression. So I'm hopeful that what I do here is to identify those things that are possible, but it's not for me to do them at all. It's for the government, it's for the media, it's for academics, it's for activists to really try to preserve, you know, the fundamental protections that come from Article 21 and then of the Constitution, to preserve those. But again, it's not for me to do. It's for me to identify and hopefully shed some light based on international human rights law for the people of Japan.
Thank you. This lady behind Anthony. Sorry, Anthony, I'll come back to you. I'm just trying to get to people who've not had a question yet. And then this lady over here.
Thank you very much. I'm Hanae Motoka from NTV. I have two questions to you. And then, did you find any reasons why they canceled in December, when you had a plan to come here the first time. And second question, you said that it is normal that there is a tension between the journalist and the government, but what is specifically, definitely, what is the differences between Japanese tensions and other countries' tensions? I mean, so, thank you.
So, as far as the cancellation, I can only tell you what was reported to us, which was essentially Japan had invited me. It was scheduled, and because of, I think, the budgeting season, let's say it was the time when the government was preparing a budget, that many government officials would not be available. And so originally it was a cancellation. We went back to the government and said, look, we're very eager to conduct this visit. And eventually we were able to settle on this past week. But you need to ask the government if you need more for, why in particular the government felt a need at the time to cancel in December. So as far as the tension goes, I talked a little bit about this. It's common for journalists to describe their role as a watchdog, right? To not just to take government information as a kind of scribe and copy it and put it online or put it in the newspaper or repeat it on the broadcast network, but it's to question it, right? It's to question government policies, it's to question government conclusions. And I think there is a tradition of that in Japan. There's very clearly a tradition of that in Japan. The concern is that that tradition has been elusive over the last couple of years. And again, that's one of the reasons why we conducted this visit, was to try to understand why that is. And so, it is normal, as I was suggesting before, for governments to push back against journalist reporting. That's part of what government does, particularly if they believe that a story is wrong. But it's the role of the media to push back on the government as well. And again, because of the legal and structural deficits that I mentioned before, it seems that there isn't the same kind of pushback that there once was, and that's my concern. And I'm hopeful that that's a concern for the people of Japan as well, because ultimately, when you look around at all of the critical issues and policy choices that people face today, particularly in the wake of an earthquake, which, as I understand it, and again, I mentioned before, I'm from Los Angeles, so I'm familiar with these kinds of concerns. There's a nuclear power plant also on a fault in the south. And that's the kind of issue that you would expect there to be rigorous discussion about in the media. I can't read Japanese, so I can't say whether that's happening or not. But that's an example of an area where you expect real media engagement, real media involvement in trying to learn the future of that particular situation, the policy that the government has, and so forth. And so, I would encourage people to look at the reporting and ask, is that particular issue being covered, or will it be? Now, of course, we're all concerned about the loss of life and ensuring that power, water, sewage come back online. But in the days and weeks ahead, is the media pushing back and trying to understand what's the future for the power plant, its security, and so forth? I'm using that only as an example because, as I said, I can't read the Japanese media to tell you what's being reported. But that would be an area where I would say, let's look and see what's being reported, how it's being reported. And then in that situation, you can say, well, is the kind of healthy tension being manifest in the actual practice of journalists?
Thank you. The lady across from the one who just, yes, this lady here. Anthony, did you still want to ask the second question?
Thank you. My name is Eiko Takeuchi. I'm a freelance journalist. You said Japanese internet and online freedom is the top class, and you say the kind of leaders of the world. But my understanding is basically no, because some of the private bloggers who wrote anti-government articles, they had suddenly shut down their accounts or their articles by the blog servers. For example, I would say the Ameba blog, which is the company president is a friend of Prime Minister Abe. So there is some those cases, and among those bloggers, which provider is better for us to allow those articles?
Is there a question coming? Do you have a question?
Yes, so this is a question. So please, and you better investigate it again. The freedom of the press among the internet.
That doesn't sound like a question. That sounds like advice.
No. I mean, questions. So, did you ever heard those things? Did you ever heard? That's my question.
Okay. So I'm not familiar with that particular situation, but one thing I would say, if I understood correctly, it's common, and it's actually a problem globally right now particularly for internet companies, social media and others, to know when they are supposed to or when they should take down media. And there's variation across social media, and there's variation across countries and governments as to when media should be taken down. Some companies have standards around civil discourse or harassment and so forth, and some of that is quite opaque right now. It's not really clear how companies are operating. So I'm really happy to learn more about the situation, and I would encourage people who are familiar with the operation of internet companies in Japan to get in touch and let us know what's happening.
Thank you. I'm going to Anthony. Do you mind if I pick on people who haven't asked a question yet, and I'll come back to you. So I saw the gentleman with his hand at the back first. Sorry, your hand up at the back of the room. Yes. Fujita-san, and then the gentleman with glasses behind Fujita-san. Would you like to ask a question? Okay. マイクまで来ていただけますか? マイクまで.
Ah, フリーランスの柴と申します。日本語で失礼します。日本の政府はですね、その紛争地取材をするジャーナリストに対して、マスコミフリーランス問わずですね、現地に行くなというようなことを言ってきまして、時にはそれ以上のこともすることがあります。具体的に妨害してきたりだとか、そういうようなことに関して、今回いろいろ話を聞かれたと思うんですけども、そういったご感想あるいはご意見などありましたらよろしくお願いします。
Thank you.
Yes, so I learned about the case that you're mentioning, and this is a case in which a photojournalist sought to go report from Syria and Iraq, and he was a war correspondent. War photojournalist, and the government simply did not want him to go to Syria. And this took place after the killings of the two Japanese journalists a year and a half, 2 years ago. So there was obviously some concern about this. And I think this is a problem. So what happened, without going into all the details of the story, what I understand is that he gave his passport up under some pressure, and when he sought a new passport, and we saw the passport, what was printed in his passport was travel is allowed to all countries except to Syria and Iraq. And we actually raised this with the foreign ministry, and we had a discussion with consular officials, and expressed our concern that that kind of restriction, even though many countries do have similar kinds of restrictions in certain times, that kind of restriction should not be applied to journalists. That particularly after the killings of the Japanese journalists, there was intense public interest to know more about the conflict in Syria. And so if a journalist is willing to essentially to take the risks of that kind of reporting, that should be something that the journalist has the ability to do. And so I think the government intervention in that case was inappropriate, and we very directly asked the ministry to reconsider its approach to journalists, in particular journalists who are reporting from conflict zones.
Thank you. Fujita-san, the gentleman behind him. I didn't see your hand, so I'll go to this gentleman over here and then come back to you on it.
Thank you. My name is Fujita, freelance with the Yuka Fuji Daily Evening paper. My friend, Kent Gilbert, California attorney living here in Japan for 40 years, said Japanese situation of freedom of press, freedom of opinion, is much better than America. So my question is, among 7 industrial nations, how would you rank Japan's status of freedom, press, freedom of opinion?
That's not a question I can answer. I mean, it's a great question to ask, but it's not a question I can answer. And I would say, first thing is very clear that no country, particularly, and this is true for well-established democratic countries like Japan, but no country is perfect. And if you go through the communications that I have sent to governments around the world over the last couple of years, you would see that I think you would come away from that thinking that that there are serious problems related to freedom of expression in many places in the democratic world. So I can't rank. I'm identifying a particular issue of concern related to media independence in Japan. I think the concern is real, and I think there are steps that can be taken in order to remedy the situation. But I'm not saying in this report, or even by visiting Japan, that one country is better than another. There are just there's different strengths, and there's different weaknesses. Some are related to law, some are related to media organization, and so forth.
Thank you. The gentleman behind Fujita-san, the gentleman over here, the lady who's had her hand up over there. Yes, no, sorry, you're third. 3番目の方です。すいません。ごめんなさい。はい。
TBS の星名です。日本語で失礼します。ヘイトスピーチの状況について、Kayeさんは調査したと思うんですけれども、日本ではどのような状況があると考えたでしょうか。それと今、国会で法案について審議していますけれども、これは罰則のない理念法を今審議しているんですけれども、ヘイトスピーチを規制するための法案は必要でしょうか。でもし必要であると考えるならば、どういうものであるべきだとお考えでしょうか。よろしくお願いします。
I'm glad you raised that issue. So it's true that I was lucky to meet with members of the Judicial Affairs Committee in the Diet, and I learned about, in a general way, what they're thinking about with respect to hate speech. And I also learned from members of civil society about their concern about increasing prevalence of hateful speech, particularly directed, from what I was told, directed against members of the Korean minority in Japan. So I have a couple of responses to this kind of issue. So the first is every country needs to have anti-discrimination law, because even worse than hate speech are hate acts, right? So acts of discrimination in employment, in housing, in other areas, need to be subject to penalty. that's part of Japan's obligation under the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. And I think that's a first step, is have an anti-discrimination law. And I don't think it's useful to only focus on the side of hate speech. But that's not to say that hate speech can't also receive some legal attention. Now, the discussion that I had at the Diet gave me the impression that that the Diet members are considering approaching hate speech through what I think is a valuable approach, although I can't comment on any official text. But I think that what came out of that conversation was that there's consideration about first opposing hate speech as a matter of government policy and law, but also increasing educational approaches to anti-discrimination, increasing the kind of encouragement of government officials to speak out against hate speech. My understanding is that they're not looking at criminal penalties for hate speech. And I actually think that at least that part, again, I'm not commenting on the entire law because I haven't seen any official legislation, but criminalization of expression, of any kind of expression, is often very problematic. And I'd be very concerned about any kind of hate speech law that could be used actually against those who are targets of hate speech. And I would also say that hate speech as a concept is not it's not defined as a concept in international law. There's no treaty that defines hate speech. And so that openness, I understand that even in Japanese, the word for hate speech is hate speech. So I think it's important to be very, very careful to first adopt an anti-discrimination law, and second, or at the same time, address hate speech, but not do it in a way that inadvertently undermines freedom of expression more generally.
Thank you. The gentleman at the back. Thank you.
琉球新報の荒垣と申します。日本語で失礼します。沖縄ではですね、新しい米軍基地を作ることに反対する抗議運動が起きております。その運動する市民に対する弾圧がひどくあります。また先ほどのヘイトスピーチやヘイトクライムというのが市民に、襲いかかっています。さらに、沖縄の新聞2紙に対してですね、政権の政治家が潰した方がいいというようなですね、圧力発言もあります。そういった沖縄の表現の自由に関する状況についてのですね、印象とご意見をお願いします。
Thank you. We actually raised issues around protest in and around Okinawa. And in fact, it's been an issue that I've focused on in the past. Even before coming to Japan, we communicated with the government about our concerns related to allegations of repression of demonstrations, both in the water around the base in Okinawa and on land, particularly allegations of excessive use of force. So we raised these issues both with the National Police and with the Coast Guard. I think both agencies understand that we're going to continue to follow this issue and hopefully monitor. We also heard about certain kinds of hate speech and pressures on the local press in Okinawa. And I think those are all very concerning issues. I wouldn't say that we have enough information to address them comprehensively, but we expect to continue to follow it both by engaging with the community in Okinawa over the coming months and engaging with the government to the extent we have questions and concerns related to these allegations.
Thank you. Sorry, this gentleman here and Sonotsugi. Hi, this gentleman here. Yeah, You put your hand up. We have about 10 minutes left, and Mr. Kaye has to leave on the dot. He's got a flight to catch. Could you keep your questions short from now on? Thank you.
2つあります。毎日新聞の青島と申します。今日はどうもありがとうございました。日本語で質問させてください。一つは、特定秘密保護法ですが、変えるべきだとおっしゃいましたが、具体的にはどの点を変えるべきだと思っていらっしゃいますか。秘密の範囲が広くなりがちだという点でしょうか、それともジャーナリストの問題でしょうか。2つ目はですね、日本の情報公開法について調べられましたでしょうか。改正する必要などは感じているでしょうか。以上です。
I think that that the SDS, the Specially Designated Secrets Act, needs to be addressed in a couple of different ways. So the specific suggestions that I make in these preliminary observations focus on a few areas. So one is the definitions of the categories of information that may be classified as secret are quite broad. I welcome the fact that the government, particularly through the Cabinet Research Office, has attempted to narrow those definitions, but I think that those categories are still quite broad and need to be narrowed. It would be best if that was done legislatively, but at the very least there should be efforts to narrow it in a very transparent way through regulation. The second is whistleblower protection, and maybe this is where we could talk about the law on information disclosure. I'm by no means an expert in the information disclosure law, but I think that between that, the Whistleblower Protection Act, and the Specially Designated Secrets Act, there's significant uncertainty that could make it difficult for journalists in particular to know where they might be placed into some legal jeopardy as they're pursuing stories. So I think this is an issue both in terms of the exceptions under the law on information disclosure, which I believe creates an exception for national security. But more generally, I think the three laws together create enough uncertainty that, unless the journalist happens to also be an information disclosure lawyer, that they may be really unwilling and thus deterred from pursuing stories that are sensitive and at the same time very much in the public interest.
Thank you. The lady at the back of the room who's been waiting.
どうもありがとうございます。またお会いできて光栄です。言論表現の自由を守る会、はい、自由を守る会の事務局長の柿内恒子と申します。私たちの会は、私は看護師でもございます。ずっと79年から看護師として働いております。職業ずっと看護師です。2003年からですね、政府を批判するビラを配布した市民が次々と逮捕されていったわけです。まるで白バラのグループの逮捕されて5日後に処刑されたミュンヘン大学の若者たちと同じようなこと。ただ処刑はされません。地裁、高裁、最高裁、大きな事件で6事件のうち無罪を勝ち取ったのは現在私たちの代表を務めている堀越昭夫さんただ一人です。6事件のうち5事件は最高裁で有罪になっているわけです。そして外務省これ作った
すいません、
はい、
質問
はい、
ありますか。
国際人権規約を79年に批准しているわけですが、この時に個人通報制度も早期に批准しましょうと当時自民党政権下で全会派一致で決議を挙げているのですが、いまだにどの個人通報制度、自由権も社会権も社会権もできてますし、子どもの権利もございますね。それですが全く批准しておりません。ですから欧州の状況、欧州はこれよりもっと厳しい欧州人権条約が生きております。個人通報制度もあります。しかしこの日本がないがゆえにね、
質問お願いします。すいません、時間がないのでお願いします。質問ください。
はい、 話してる時にごめんなさい、本当に
わかりましたけれども、
でプロジェクトピース9、はい、そうです。まだ日本は個人通報制度を批准していないがゆえに人権鎖国状態である。民法も刑事司法も江戸時代なんだと。鎖国をするためには個人通報制度を批准するしかないんです。ぜひそれをね、その重要性と、そして参政権が必要だと。日本国民は正当に選挙された国会の代表を通じて行動しと、日本国憲法全部はそこから始まっているのですが、この公職選挙法とか、だから参政権がいかに必要なのかということをね、国連のトップの方たち、来日UN ウィメンの村本ヌクカ事務局長にも質問しても、問題があるんだったら裁判を起こせばいいでしょうっておっしゃるんです。司法三権分立が確立しなければ、す
いません、もう
三権分立させることが確立、
質問来ないので、
ですからそのためにやはりね。
Can I say something about the pamphlets? Maybe this would be because you raise an issue of pamphleting that I think is something that we identify. And then because I have to leave soon, so we should enable maybe one or two more questions. It's clear, as I mentioned before, that the law related to political campaigning, in combination with perhaps some other laws, makes it difficult for individuals to do the kind of leafleting and flyering that your pizza delivery person might do. And so we know that there was a case that went to the Supreme Court related to pamphleting, and yet I'm still concerned that there are issues around that kind of political campaigning in which the restrictions are pretty serious, and in which individuals can be subject to at least civil penalties. So I think that's an area where, again, as I mentioned at the outset around political campaigning, that there could be more openness and willingness to allow that kind of expression.
Thank you. This gentleman, you had your hand up, yep. And I think we might squeeze in one more question after that. Could you keep your question short if possible?
Thank you for this press conference. My name is Kitano Ryuichi from Asahi Shimbun. 日本語で質問いたします。匿名で答える記者が多かったという話ですが、これは記者側が匿名を希望したのか、それともその内容のためにKayeさんご自身が匿名でという条件でお話を聞いたのか、これが第一点です。それから慰安婦問題についてのコメントがニュースレリースの中にあります。でこれは歴史問題について発言をする市民が多いんですが、それを政府がどのような態度で歴史問題に対処していくかというところが問われているんではないかというふうに理解したのですが、そのことについてもコメントをお願いします。
That was 2 questions.
So I have half the time. So I would. So yes, the first question. There were some journalists who asked for anonymity. And they would not have been comfortable sharing information with us and sharing their perspective if they didn't have that. As journalists, that you're used to that kind of protection of your sources. As human rights fact finders, we have the same basic rules. So on the second question, so our particular focus, and we know there is a broad interest in the issue of comfort women, the history around it, sort of the bilateral relationship between Japan and South Korea. We know there are a number of issues there. We're particularly interested in allegations that we heard related to textbooks. And in particular, our understanding is that in the middle school, is where Japanese students have compulsory education, compulsory courses around Japanese history, and then high school becomes world history. So, so we had heard from, and was brought to our attention, that there's been a kind of decreasing space for discussion in those textbooks around the historical situation of comfort women. And so this was a part of our investigation. We actually had a very good meeting with the Ministry of Education just the other day, in which we learned about the process by which textbooks are approved. Despite the fact that that was a very good meeting, I remain concerned that the process it's not insulated from politics. And it's very clear that the discussion around the history is both a historical issue, but it's been a historical issue that's been politicized. And so my concern is that the textbooks really need to adequately reflect, this particularly shameful episode of history, and that it shouldn't be influenced by government policy about how that episode took place, that it should be focused on historical issues, historical accuracy, and the opinions of experts. Now, the ministry gave me some examples of why it's not subject to that kind of influence, but I remain concerned, and one of my recommendations, and again, these are preliminary observations, we'll be making a fuller report to the Human Rights Council next year. But one of my preliminary recommendations is that the government consider focusing and perhaps revising the way in which members of the Textbook Investigation Council are actually appointed. And hopefully that could remove some of the perception, at least, of political influence over the textbooks.
Thank you so much. I did announce at the start that we would have simultaneous translation, or sorry, not simultaneous translation, but we would have live streaming, but technology has made a liar out of me. Apparently, we haven't been live streaming because there was a technical fault, but the entire press conference will run tomorrow on YouTube for anybody who wants to follow up. Just to summarize some of the points that were made, the Keisha Club system, the press club system, should be abolished. Japan needs an anti-discrimination law. Japan is a model of internet freedom. And the independence of the press faces serious threats. So we look forward to seeing how those comments are reported in the media later on tonight. And we also look forward to our regular bashing online from trolls and nationalists. Should be good fun. So thanks so much for Mr. Kaye for coming along, for giving such a succinct and interesting press conference. And would you please show your appreciation to him for coming along?
Thank you. Thank you.